Just after 7 a.m., British artillery fire rained down across the entire front. I jumped to my feet, grabbed my flare gun, and ran upstairs. Shortly after, I saw the wave of fire coming toward us. The trenches were covered in smoke and fire. The sentries ahead rapidly retreated, and the trenches were occupied. The sentry standing next to me suddenly started shouting, "Commander, something four-cornered is coming." I immediately looked in that direction and realized it was a tank. The piece perched on its roof indeed gave it a square appearance. We thought we could handle 1 or 2 tanks. We had no idea there were so many of them. We opened fire immediately. But unfortunately, we could not make the slightest impact on this monster. The British drew lessons from the disaster they had suffered on the first day of the Somme. Infantry tactics had been seen as unimportant during the initial assault. This had led to tens of thousands of casualties. 2 weeks after the catastrophe of July 1st, intensive preparations were made for the assault that would take place on July 14th. Every step the infantry would take was planned. Determined not to relive the first day's disaster, the British would capture the positions previously marked in no man's land and launch their assault. In the week prior to the Somme, hundreds of thousands of shells had been fired at German trenches, yet the desired effect had not been achieved. On July 14th, the German trenches would be pounded again, this time with 5 times as many shells. The British were determined to play the game differently this time. In previous attacks, trenches had been bombarded for hours or even days, and only after some time had passed would the assault begin. This time things would be different. Everything started as the British had hoped. German trenches were being pounded with deafening intensity. The Germans had no opportunity to even raise their heads. But the real surprise was yet to come. Almost like a precursor to what would later become the hallmark of German warfare, the Blitzkrieg tactic, the British launched an assault with terrifying intensity immediately after the bombardment. The Germans, who hadn't even had a chance to breathe after the hell created by the artillery, were stunned when confronted by the British attack. In the first minutes of the battle, the British were quickly taking the German forward trenches. Having also captured the support lines, the British were very hopeful about this assault. However, once it came to the main trenches, the fundamental rules of the game came into play once again. This war was always more merciful to the defenders. The labyrinth-like trenches stretching for dozens of kilometers began to slow the infantry assault. As had happened many times before, the assault turned into a horrific war of attrition. Still, despite the losses, July 14th was an assault that gave the British courage. General Haig began planning another offensive. But reinforcements and new plans had to be completed first. That's why they would wait until September. The 2-month interim period will go down in history as another horrific phase called the Forgotten Battles. During this period, the British launched exactly 90 small assaults on German trenches, while the Germans responded with 75 counterattacks. The darkest period of the Somme was the Forgotten Battles. For a mere 5 square kilometers of land, the British would suffer 80,000 casualties. During this difficult waiting period, a massive deployment was being carried out to the front under extreme secrecy. This shipment carried a major surprise, both for the British soldiers in the trenches and for the German troops across from them. No first child has ever been greeted with as much excitement as mother, and no mother has ever loved playing with her child as much as we loved playing with it. Training with it is like playing with a giant toy. We drive around crushing trees. We imagine entering Berlin with it and have fun. This is how Basil Henri Quays, commander of one of the first tanks ever built, described his introduction to the tank. It was a monumental event for everyone. There was no equivalent, no precedent. Everyone was encountering it for the first time. But being inside these new toys was a terrifying experience for the soldiers. Our tank goes 8 kilometers per hour. We're a bit faster than the infantry walking beside us. At maximum speed, the smell, the heat, and worst of all, the noise, each one is unbearably horrific. The time had come to test these toys. The tanks, which had been worked on for months and built from scratch, were now taking the stage for the very first time. 49 Mark I tanks were stationed with great secrecy behind the lines near the Somme trenches. It was decided that the tanks would move in small groups of 3. Each crew member was given a leather helmet, a pair of goggles, a gas mask, and a pistol. The already cramped interior of the tank was filled to the brim with barrels of motor oil and 30,000 rounds of ammunition for machine guns. The conditions inside the tank were horrific. The expectations for these first tanks sent to the front were clear: reach the enemy trenches, cross the barbed wire, silence the machine guns, and rain hell on those in the trenches. If hell is as bad as what I saw at Courcelette, I wouldn't want even my worst enemy to go there. On the night of September 14th to 15th, the tanks moved to their starting points. The tank assault would begin near Delville Wood. What would happen here would lead soldiers to call the forest Devil's Wood. Each tank was given a route to follow and the exact time it would leave its starting point. About half an hour before sunrise, at around 6:10, the engines that would usher in a new era were started. According to the plan, the tanks would reach the first enemy trenches a few minutes before the infantry and wait for them there. With heavy bombardment beginning from the British trenches, the infantry and the tanks in front of them began to move. Both the soldiers inside the tanks and the infantry around them were very excited. Would this new invention actually work? The real question was, how would the German soldiers react upon seeing these monsters? The British secrecy efforts had paid off. Not a single German knew what was coming. The Germans observing from the trenches first began to hear a sound in the distance. One of my soldiers stared for a long time, as if he had lost the strength in his limbs. He seemed frozen. The great monsters were slowly but steadily advancing toward us. Another soldier shouted, "The devil is coming." Many of them lost control from fear. The Germans were horrified by what they saw. Most of the soldiers had never even seen an ordinary car in their lives. The first thing they encountered was these terrifying giants. As they approached the trenches, some soldiers, trying to shake off the initial shock, set up their machine guns and began to fire at the tanks. But the key to the war, the machine gun, had finally met its match. It could hardly do any damage to the tanks. The tanks, advancing slowly but confidently, were now very close to the trenches. Against the approaching monsters, the German soldiers were helpless. Some tried to resist, some screamed, and a large number began fleeing toward the rear trenches. Encountering tanks was a terrifying experience. For the tanks that had reached the trenches, it was now time to use the advantage of their design. The very purpose of the machine guns placed on both sides was this: to rain death upon the trenches. Near the village of Flers, one of the tanks reached the trenches, effectively cleared them out for a while, then continued on and swung behind German lines. In fact, in one trench extension, it took the Germans by surprise and captured 300 terrified German soldiers. The new toy had had a terrifying effect on the enemy. Across the front, thousands of German soldiers panicked and fled upon first contact with the tank. September 15th was the tank's first performance. But it was still far from opening the door to victory. Although it had a significant impact on the Germans, both the assault and the tanks were a major fiasco. Of the 49 tanks brought in for the assault, only 9 managed to achieve their objective. 17 of the 49 tanks broke down before even reaching the front line. 9 suffered mechanical failure during the operation. 5 got stuck in the muddy terrain of no man's land and its surroundings. 9 tanks were heavily damaged and stopped, effectively being used like artillery batteries or machine gun nests. Only 9 tanks reached the points planned before the operation, significantly reducing infantry casualties, crossing barbed wire and machine guns, and breaking up the trenches. The new invention was new to everyone. The generals and commanders had virtually no more tank training than the soldiers in the trenches. Therefore, it was used very poorly. The tanks had been distributed among the infantry units. A plan had been adopted for them to operate independently from one another. This prevented them from creating a serious impact. In addition, the terrain was poorly chosen and poorly studied. Communications were a disaster. Because of the tank noise, let alone communicating with the outside, soldiers couldn't even hear their own voices. Some tanks, acting without knowledge of one another, lost their way. Carrier pigeons were used to communicate with headquarters. One tank even had to return because it had forgotten pigeon feed. The tank commander's field of vision was also extremely narrow. Being inside a tank was like a mental war. One tank commander even said that he got so frustrated with his tank that he fired his pistol at the engine to make it go faster. 2 tank commanders would later admit to having a panic attack during the assault. The first operation involving tanks at the Somme, the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, in general terms, also a fiasco. The objective of the assault was to break through the German line via the Somme and open a major breach. But shortly after the failed September assault, the autumn rains arrived and the trenches overflowed with water. Advancing became increasingly difficult, and the Germans were regaining their footing. Like many earlier operations at the Somme, this one would also end in failure, with an incredible number of casualties. Although not as large in scale as the Somme, the battles of Thiepval and Beaumont-Hamel were also significant in terms of experience. Both were points where the Germans had held out with firm resistance and could not be overcome by infantry assaults alone. At Thiepval, for the first time, an attack was launched using only tanks and infantry without artillery or other supporting weapons. The enemy trenches were crossed so quickly that the Germans could not even get their machine guns out of their bunkers to respond. Though the number of tanks used in the engagement was small, they were important for the psychological effect they would demonstrate later on. The soldiers who participated in the battles shared a common view. They said that German soldiers who were in a position to win the battle surrendered collectively under psychological pressure when faced with tanks. Yet in history's first tank-involved battle, the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, the 9 tanks that achieved success were critically important. Their success showed that the tank was a workable idea. They had significantly reduced casualties and effectively saved the lives of hundreds of tanks being manufactured in factories. The tanks had not produced the desired overall effect, but General Haig bore a significant share of the blame for this. Because of his impatience, the tanks had been deployed to the field prematurely. His constant fear that the great secret would be exposed only heightened his impatience. The discussions about how tanks should be used were not yet over. Even the engineers hadn't finished their work. The tank crews, selected from the Navy and machine gun units, didn't even know what they were working on for a long time due to the extreme secrecy. Their training had been purely theoretical, without access to any actual tanks. Additionally, Haig had rushed into the assault to beat the autumn rains. All these factors contributed significantly to the failure. One of the most important names in the birth of the tank, Winston Churchill, harshly criticized Douglas Haig. He would say that by prematurely revealing their invention, all elements of surprise and the entire plan had been ruined. The premature use of a handful of tanks exposed the jealously guarded secret of this newly discovered key to the French deadlock and sacrificed the right to a decisive strategic surprise for the sake of a local success. Nevertheless, Many began to believe that this invention could become much more effective in the future. Douglas Haig, in particular, was deeply impressed by how helpless it left the enemy, the support it gave to infantry, and the significant reduction in casualties. Indeed, just 4 days after the September 15th attack, the debut of the tank, he placed an order for another 1,000 tanks, clearly showing his admiration. Another concern for the British was the tanks lost at the Somme. Some of these tanks fell into German hands. They were handed over to German engineers for examination, and Germany would rapidly join the tank race. Although tanks could not unlock victory in 1916, the improvements made day by day would eventually change the course of the war. At the same time as the British, the French were preparing a surprise of their own. In France, the driving force behind the tank was Jean-Baptiste Estienne. General Estienne had shown his vision early in the war, before tanks had even been invented, with a remarkable statement. "Gentlemen, victory in this war will go to the side that is first to mount a 75mm gun on a vehicle capable of crossing all kinds of terrain." The first concrete tank concepts in France came from the artillery officer Estienne. As was often the case in the First World War, Estienne was both an officer and an inventor. Even before the war, he was designing infantry support equipment and spending a great deal of time in military factories. He closely followed the Russo-Japanese War and the Balkan War, closely observing the new generation warfare that unfolded there. Estienne's innovative ideas were not accepted in the early stages of the war. The French military already had armored vehicles in its inventory. Due to their failures in trench combat, the French were skeptical of Estienne's proposals. When he initially failed to gain the support he sought from the army, Estienne reached out to Schneider, a military-industrial firm researching tank concepts. Schneider was more receptive to Estienne's innovative thinking. Thus, Estienne began collaborating with engineer Auguste Eugène Brillier to develop a prototype. The first goal set for the tank was to be a vehicle capable of crossing barbed wire. However, as Estienne wanted to fully armor the vehicle and equip it with various weapons, the design kept evolving day by day. The prototype work that began in December 1915 was completed in March 1916. The first fruit of this intense labor would be the Schneider CA-1. The CA-1 came from the French term char d'assaut, assault tank. By late 1915, it was clear that the war had reached a deadlock. The French army, suffering from horrific casualty numbers, had begun searching for solutions. It was during this time that Officer Estienne, who clearly saw the war's deadlock, managed to persuade General Pétain, and the French army placed an order for 400 tanks. However, the Schneider CA-1, like almost every country's first wartime tank, would turn out to be largely a failure. Its appearance was very odd. The chassis was taken directly from Holt tractors without any modifications. The British had adapted the same chassis to suit the Mark I, but since the French used it as is, the result looked strange. The tracks were quite short in relation to the tank. Additionally, its overall size was much smaller than the Mark I. Production continued with the belief that this smaller size would make the tank harder to hit. However, the tank's design was a complete fiasco. Especially the gun at the front was a serious design flaw. The gun barrel was very short. Its firing angle and range were extremely poor due to faulty design. The short tracks also caused major problems in trench warfare. Because of its physical structure, the Schneider would frequently get stuck in no man's land, bomb craters and German trenches, becoming a nightmare for its crew. The tracks struggled to support the oversized upper body. In rain, mud and soft terrain, that is, under even mildly problematic ground conditions, the unevenly distributed weight caused it to get bogged down. One of the most famous generals of Second World War, George Patton, had volunteered with the French army during World War I. Patton would describe the Schneider CA-1 as the worst tank of the First World War. The tank caused so many problems that the planned improved models were shelved and remained only on paper. The French tank efforts had shifted from providing relief to frontline soldiers to becoming more of a financial competition. While Schneider was working on tank production, another major company also began manufacturing tanks. Named after the town where it was produced, Saint-Chamond would become the second tank adopted by the French army. However, this tank would be an even greater fiasco than the Schneider CA1. The use of the Holt tractor chassis and short tracks made the tank's movement significantly flawed. Instead of the short-barreled 75mm gun used on the Schneider, it was equipped with a full-size field gun of the same caliber. The field gun size created a large protrusion at the front of the tank. The vehicle might have performed well on flat terrain, but on the Western Front, flat ground was almost non-existent. The 2-meter protrusion caused by the field gun created problems in every trench and dip. The Germans found a simple solution to counter these tanks. Attacking tanks could drive over German trenches and keep going. But if the trenches were widened, the tanks would have to drop into them and then climb out. In this way, Saint-Chamond, with its nose extending 2 meters forward, would get stuck while descending into trenches. Since the tank was produced simultaneously with the CA1, it shared many of the same issues. As seen, France's second tank attempt would also end in disaster. However, toward the end of the war, a model to be produced by Louis Renault through Estienne's efforts might change the very fate of tanks. Estienne had been in contact with the British since early 1916. He had witnessed the birth of tanks firsthand. He believed that tanks, as allies, should be used jointly in operations. While the British rapidly completed the development of the Mark I, Estienne tried to convince them to wait for the French tank, but he failed. Schneider, the firm that manufactured many of the French army's artillery pieces, tried to keep pace with the British, but it was unsuccessful. In fact, the British rushed to produce and deploy their tanks, which caused Estienne's plans for coordinated tank usage to fall apart. The year 1916 became a showcase year for tanks. It was now almost certain that tanks would take center stage in 1917. Tanks would be used more professionally, with better coordination with aircraft. Instead of small, paired deployments, mass tank assaults would become the hallmark of 1917. Moreover, British tanks would no longer be alone on the battlefield. France had also begun deploying its tanks and expanded tank usage on the Western Front. It wasn't just the attackers who evolved, the defenders would too. For the first time, the Germans used armor-piercing bullets, laying the foundation for anti-tank tactics. They also began placing multiple rows of trenches one after the other to make it harder for tanks to break through. Furthermore, instead of positioning their artillery in fixed locations, they began distributing them between trenches for use against tanks. Although Somme and Verdun didn't deliver a conclusive result to either side, their consequences would influence the course of the war. Germany was fighting alone against three great powers. On the Western Front, the British and French. On the Eastern Front, the Russians. All were putting immense pressure on the Germans. Verdun, which had been initiated by Falkenhayn and had turned into a nightmare for the Germans, had given birth to the Somme. The Germans, who sought to bleed the French at Verdun, would also be struck from the east. In early June, Russia, seeking to aid its allies, knock Austria-Hungary out of the war, and corner Germany, would launch the Brusilov offensive, named after General Alexei Brusilov. The Germans attacking the French at Verdun would now find themselves squeezed by the British at the Somme and the Russians in the east. The year 1917 would become a year of more offensives, more casualties, more trenches, more horror,